By way of introduction, my name is Elaine Yau. I am academic liaison and associate curator at the Berkeley Art Museum, where I've been working for about 7 years. I'm also a Cal graduate. I did my PhD in history of art, and it's just been such a thrill to be to actually stay on campus and to be able to serve and work with students in this in my new capacity. Okay, so I always begin the tour with a little bit of basic context because institutionally speaking, this show really could not have come together were it not for the bequest given by the collector Eli Leon to the museum in 2019. Some of you may be familiar with him. He was based in North Oakland and over the course of nearly 3 decades assembled a collection of over 3,000 quilts, primarily made by African American men and women. And I'm showing you a picture of him on the screen in his home storage. This is really what it looked, if you ever wonder what 3,000 quilts might look like, here's a taste of it. So the bequest itself, as I mentioned, was given in 2019. I'm showing you a picture of our storage space off-site in Richmond. So you can see it consists of about 3,275 quilts and tops. But I think the thing that was really incredible was that the majority of them had attributions, meaning we had names of the artists, which, as I think many of you might understand, that quilts often come without a name. They're often anonymous, which makes it really challenging to understand a little bit more about the cultural history of how an object was made. But here we had so many attributions, and we also had Eli's archive, which made the research, I think, that much more rich. And of course, this is not the first time we have shown quilts from Eli's collection. Some of you might recall in 2020, right around the pandemic, we organized Rosie Lee Tompkins, a retrospective. That was a show that I worked on with our former director. And it really celebrated the work of this Richmond-based artist and her extraordinary quilts. But what's different with the show that's on view now is that it's a group exhibition representing the work of over 80 women and men. This exhibition traces the flow and flourishing of African American quilts in the context of the Second Great Migration. So that movement of people between the years of 1940 to about 1970, and really premised upon both a desire to escape racialized terror in the Black South, in the Jim Crow South, but also the promise of economic mobility that the World War II, that the war effort offered during during the 40s in particular. So I always like to show these maps first. This is a spread taken from the exhibition's catalog. And I think you can see here all of the counties and the names of the artists that are represented in the show. They come from this region of northern Louisiana, southern Arkansas, East Texas, Oklahoma, parts of Mississippi, which really tracks with the demographic of African American migrants during this middle part of the 20th century. And then the companion map here I'm showing you are where those very same people lived for a period of their lives in the East Bay. You can see a lot of concentration in West Oakland and South Berkeley. There's another little cluster around Richmond where the Kaiser shipyards were, of course, and where many of these families eventually settled either in like shipyard worker housing or in the developments that emerged in the decades after the war. There's a little bit more representation in San Francisco. And then in this little inset map, I hope you can see some more quilters represented from the Central Valley and Southern California. But the show really begins, I think, with any story of Black migration, it begins in the Black South. And here I'm showing you one installation view of some of the quilts in this first section. So there are really a diversity of styles here because African Americans did not work in any one particular way. Let's see, I think I'm going to show you this installation shot. And this comparison here is one that I think really shows two really different approaches to working with scraps and to working improvisationally. So on the left, you have a quilt by Minnie Skinner, which she has made by repurposing work clothes made out of denim. I think you can see really easily where areas where the pockets have been removed and the dye is a bit darker than the faded areas around the thigh and the knees. But by contrast, the quilt by Emma Hall that is right next to it is pieced in the double wedding ring pattern. This is a pattern-based quilt, but I hope that you can also see moments where kind of like the wobbliness of the overall design, in addition to the bold colors, really give it a sense of dynamism that comes when comes out of the overall construction not being so exacting and precisely geometrically pieced. And I think I have a few details, right? So this is a detail of that Minnie Skinner quilt, a close-up of the denim, but you can also see a close-up of the yellow threads. Now, that is a technique to securing the 3 layers of a quilt called tying off or tacking a quilt. And you can imagine it's a much more efficient way of securing 3 layers of a quilt together than having running stitches going across the surface. Given here, I'm going to go back here so you can see the overall. This quilt was made in the late 1940s. Skinner had lived through the Great Depression, a period where creative reuse and thrift were so embedded in the culture, right? If you were trying to survive, especially in the Black rural South. So the notion that she would repurpose work clothes, unfortunately, you can't see it here, but there is also a repurposed blanket that is in the inside between the top and the backing. And so many layers of this quilt quite literally embody that spirit of creative reuse. This would have been a period of time where simply to buy a yard of new fabric would have cost a day's wages. And here's another really great close-up. But also in this section, we have a quilt like this one by Pearlie Rayford, which I hope in the detail you can also see where the flower petals of these dahlias have been appliqued onto a neutral colored backing, and that the quilt stitching itself has been so beautifully and exquisitely executed, where even here in the negative spaces, you can see leaf patterns that mimic the shape of the petals. So Pearlie Rayford most likely purchased a quilting kit in order to execute this quilt. And in the 30s and 40s, there really was sort of a nationwide industry and market for quilts. You could find quilt patterns in nationally syndicated columns in your local newspaper that you could clip out and use as a basis for your own quilts. Or as I mentioned, you could buy a kit with a lot of these fabrics and shapes pre-cut for you to create yourself. So just in terms of, we spoke about kind of these like scrappy repurposed quilts, but also at the same time, you could also have quilters working very precisely from patterns. And now here is another view of that same gallery. Now this pair, which I hope you see here, they actually opened the exhibition, are really special because they represent work by the 2 oldest quilters in the exhibition, 2 sisters, Monin Brown and Hattie Mitchell, who were born enslaved in the 1850s, we think in either Virginia or around Georgia. But the 2 of them lived together until the end of both of their lives in Macon, Georgia. Both of them were employed by a very wealthy banking family of the city. But I put this pair up just so you can see that you have 2 sisters who are working in 2 very different styles of quilts. The scrappier one on the left is something my colleagues have called, it's just patchwork. You could there are some blocks there that are kind of scrappy and long and narrow. If you're a quilter out there, I think we would call that a string-pieced block. But the one on the right is also really extraordinary. Hattie Mitchell created this quilt with its red and green botanical forms in the context of a trip that her employers, the Johnston family, took to France, and she accompanied them as their domestic servant. And here are some close-ups of those very quilts. The way that she went about constructing it was collecting leaves from the many different cities and coastal towns that they visited. She traced them and created these fabric templates that she then appliqued onto the surface. Mr. Johnston, her employer, traced out the names of all of the places, and you can see here where she's embroidered over his own writing. So it's a really interesting quilt where the history is a little murky. Like, for example, we don't know whose idea it was to create this quilt. Did the idea for the quilt come from the Johnstons, or was it of her own initiative that she wanted to create something like this? We really don't know the context for kind of collaborating, right, with the Johnstons to write the text and then for her to stitch and embroider. But overall, as an overall object, I think it really stands as a remarkable quilt that is somewhat of like a souvenir album of their travels together. But I think it opens up a lot of other questions too about even Hattie Mitchell's own sensibility and her own experience traveling as a formerly enslaved Black woman, still working for a white family. What would it have been like for her to make yet a transatlantic trip that her ancestors had made just in the other direction? Or for her to have to be living in a highly segregated environment in Georgia, to then be in a little bit more liberal place like Europe. I think of course, I have no answers to these questions, but I think the fact that this object survives and the story really, I think, invites us to ask those questions that that the history books might not even be able to document for us. So I'm giving you some more installation shots so we can kind of like travel together in this space. So this hallway that we're looking at opens the second section of the show, entitled Carried and Kept. So now the quilts that you see on the left and the right were all made in the Black South, but were also carried out of the South by either the quilt maker herself or somebody in her family who would have inherited the quilt. So this section really thinks about the ways that quilts carry memory and deep personal meaning, all of these reasons for why a quilt would have been preserved within a family. And here I just want to show you two close-ups of some of those quilts. Okay, so sorry, just to go back, I'm showing you a close-up of these two right here. So the one on the left is made out of corduroy, and I think you can see there are these strips of fabric that have been stacked on top of each other and then sewn together across to create a larger block. Made by Susan Pless out of Oklahoma, eastern Oklahoma. And this quilt was brought out to Fresno by one of her daughters, Gracelle Tate. And this detail of the log cabin quilt was made by Anna Nicholson out of Mississippi. And we know from some genealogical research that I've been able to conduct that Anna Nicholson came out to California with her husband and her son, both of whom worked at Port Chicago. But this thematic of quilts being carried out of the South and quilts themselves as carriers of memory continues into this smaller gallery where I want to focus a little bit on the portrait quilt that you see at the end of the room. Oh, and this is just to give you another view of what that gallery looks like. But this quilt is made by an artist, Alice Neal, not to be confused with the New York painter. But Alice Neal was born in northern Louisiana and came out to Oakland with her husband in the 1940s and eventually ran a small corner shop. But Alice Neal made this really extraordinary quilt between 1955 and 1956, about 9 months after her mother passed away. Her mother's name was Mary Bright, and she is the woman that you see represented in the frame. Alice Neal based her portrait off of a family photograph, where you can actually see the same polka dotted pattern, the same lace collar and the hat being worn by her mother, but she's adapted those same personal materials into her own quilt. In a really fun detail, the hat actually snaps off and it reveals this silk headscarf that her mother was fond of wearing when she did not have to leave the house. And then in the detail, I hope you can see just some of the embroidery work, where Alice Neal, for example, has written out her own name. Right here is actually the death date of her mother, and a little bit cut off, but I think you can see it in the larger image, is where she's embroidered the date when she finished and completed the quilt. But there are, throughout this object are just layers and layers of personal connection. All of the quilt pattern blocks that you see here, there's the fan, flying geese, basket of flowers, the monkey wrench or the churn dash, the Dresden plate, the Star of Lemoyne. These are all patterns that Alice Neal would have known because Mary Bright was her first quilt teacher. And of course, all of these patterns that have been quilted onto the surface are hand quilted at about 8 stitches per inch, really exacting work. And then there's also another layer to this story where Alice Neal intended this quilt to lay on a bed on a family house museum on the family land in Louisiana that she had hoped to establish. Now that intention was never fully realized for reasons we don't really know, but it was in that context that Alice Neal eventually thought that Eli Leon, this collector, would be the best steward and keeper of the family legacy. And so it was in that context that she ended up selling it to him. And so it's gratifying to some small extent that we have this on view at the Berkeley Art Museum, where it can have its public audience. Another quilt in this room is always a crowd pleaser, and I think you can see is really different. It has its own sense of wobbliness and curves and wonkiness. This quilt was made by Thomas Covington, one of 4 male quilters featured in the exhibition. And so much of the information we have about this quilt comes from one of Covington's daughters, who is in her late 90s. Covington's daughter shared with me that her father and her mother were actually both quilters, but represented 2 really different philosophies. Her mother, on the one hand, who was a seamstress and created clothes for all of the family, was very exacting and loved creating quilts that looked pretty, and pretty was Mrs. Covington's words. By contrast, Thomas Covington created quilts that he did alongside all other kinds of rural work. He could fix a rooftop on a shed. He knew how to fix the farm equipment. He could break in wild horses. He knew how to garden and raise crops on the family farm. And on days when it was raining, when he couldn't be outside, he would quilt. And so quilting became something of a way to pass the time when he couldn't be working in other capacities. So I think you can see, without the expectation that things needed to look a certain way, he really pursued quilting with a lot of freedom. And here you see many skinny strips of fabric that were probably likely remnants from his wife's own projects, kind of put together in strips and in triangles in ways that were, or trapezoids actually, in some cases triangles, but put together in a way that, again, not strictly square, but has such like a wonderful kind of like liberated feel to it. Okay, so we're going to move on in the galleries to the 3rd section, which is entitled Tending Generations. This is a section where we are able to highlight multiple generations of quilters from single families. So what in this view that I'm showing you here on this wall, for example, with the red quilts and this really colorful one on the far right, represent three generations of quilters encompassing parts of Texas, Las Vegas, Oakland, and San Leandro. And then in this back wall here, including this really vibrant blue, orange, and yellow and red quilt in the middle, represent four generations of quilters out of East Texas. Ooh, it's a little blurry, but perhaps some of you came across this article, this in the New York Times. The reporter Jory Finkel did a really lovely profile of three generations of this Texas family. It's an article that came out in, I think, May of this year. So if you want to learn a little bit more about them, I encourage you to find that article. But as you can see, Laverne Bracken's her daughter, one of her daughters, Sherry Bird, and one of Sherry's daughters, Beira, are three generations of quilters who are still alive. In fact, they're the only living quilters who are represented in the BAMPFA collection that we've been able to reach out to. And it's been a real honor to be able to celebrate their quilting during their lifetimes. I just wanted to show you another view of that gallery where, again, you have another set of quilts from the same family, similar on this side here. This trio of quilts, sort of rounding the corner of the gallery, is also representative of the work of Gerstein Scott, who was based out of Oakland but grew up in Henderson, Texas, and the work of her great aunt, Coralie Hall Brown, who lived the entirety of her life in Mount Enterprise, Texas, but who was a prolific quilter. And I think I do have a close-up. Oh, yes. Here's one of, again, another audience favorite in the show. Gerstein Scott, as you can see, made this quilt out of repurposed neckties. Oh, I see somebody born in Henderson. Amazing. We have a lot of Henderson represented in this show for Lane. And you can see she has repurposed wholesale men's neckties. She has not cut them, she has not removed any of the interfacing, but has simply stitched them together, and maintaining the flares and the skinny portions of the object has created this quilt that is really quite, dynamic, and it like really undulates. If you see it, so this particular image was taken on a flat surface, but actually in the gallery, you can see how there's a lot of rippling on the surface. And in the detail on the right of this slide, I hope you can see a little bit about how her quilt stitching actually generates so much of that additional surface texture, creating these little like hills and valleys where the shadows are created, giving it a really sort of dazzling kind of presence when you see it up close. And here's just an image of the back. Often you see quilts with really interesting backs. I think also for the quilters among us, sometimes piecing the back is just something you do in a random way just to get the fabric coverage that you need to finish it out. And I think that's very similar to what happened here with Gerstein Scott. The diamond stars and the red diamonds that you see in the middle part of this quilt, it might look quilted, but it's actually cheater cloth. That is, it's fabric printed to look like a pieced quilt. That's what you're seeing there, along with thicker kinds of upholstered fabric to kind of give the quilt its final backing. And I'm actually noticing here for the first time, there are two neckties at the top and the bottom to kind of give it that extra support. It's a really delightful quilt. Oh, yes, but so I included this slide here to share a little bit about this family. The quilt here on the right is made by Frances Shepard, who was born in Texas, but created this quilt when she was living in Las Vegas in 1983. The quilt that you see also on the wall on the left is made by one of her daughters, R.B. Williams. And this is also another, I'm showing you all the audience favorites in this slideshow. I hope you can see it's been made out of white overalls where the seams along the pant legs have been ripped open, and she's just splayed it out and flattened it. So you can see up here are where the straps are, and she's just basically pieced it out with assorted pieces of fabric, but maintaining the entire pattern and shape of the overalls. And here's a close-up. It's Faded Glory for anybody who remembers that brand. And these really playful rainbow embroidered threads, both on the straps and across like the bib of the overalls. And then not to be forgotten too, as part of the research process for this show, I've really made it a priority to try to get connected with living descendants of many of these quilters. So I should mention both Frances Shepard and R.B. Williams have passed away. But I was able to get connected to one of R.B.'s granddaughters. Her name is Ophelia Parker, and is the one person in her family who has really taken up the tradition of quilt making, as well as kind of deepening and extended the spiritual inheritance of R.B. Williams, her grandmother. So she considers herself a very devout Christian, and a lot of her quilt making is infused with Christian themes, which is very much the case for this quilt entitled God's Promise, where these are cardinals, the cardinal birds reminded her of a piece of New Testament scripture about God's faithfulness to provide. And so it was, again, Ophenia's quilt here at the bottom was something that we ended up borrowing so we could sort of show the fuller circle of quilt making within this one family. Yeah, so then turning the corner is another a real highlight of the show, which is this installation that you see here in the corner. I realize, yeah, this case might make it a little hard to see, but what you're looking at is our quilts pieced in the double wedding ring pattern that appear as both a bed cover, floor mats, and drapes. And here is a little bit of a detail for you to see. So what you're looking at is the museum's best recreation of Isadore Whitehead's guest bedroom, the way she had it arranged in her Oakland home. She is also the artist and quilt maker. Kind of a really extraordinary opportunity as you, let's see, the vanity, the chair, the furniture, all of the accessories, the ceramics, the perfume bottles are all original to Isadore Whitehead's bedroom. You might imagine for a collector as voracious as Eli, when he caught wind of this installation in her home, he became obsessed and really, I would say, like worked on her for several years to make her an offer to purchase this room that would actually satisfy her. So because of Eli's persistence, the museum has all of the contents of the room. And so this was our best effort to recreate it and really offer, I think, a very singular vision of how a quilter lived with her art and sort of imagined it occupying her own domestic space. Now, I will say the mats are in really good condition, so I don't think she actually walked on them frequently. And everything else is actually really quite pristine. So I imagine maybe she only used this room to really get ready in the mornings, for example. But one detail I don't want you to miss, I hope you can see some of these embroidered names in some of the rings that you see on the drapes. These represent names of people in her community who donated her fabric to complete this project. So you can think of it as sort of the original donor wall for her work. And I've been trying to do a little bit more work trying to find out who these people were. Encountered a couple of roadblocks, but I'm hoping maybe somebody else can take that research up. Okay, so rounding the corner, we arrive at one of the larger sections of the show entitled Rooted West. So it's a play of words on the title of the exhibition. But all of the quilts that you see here were made between the years of 1970 and 2000. So this is a period where the quilt makers of this migrant generation are a bit older. They're in a different season of life. Many of them have left the workforce or retired. Some of them have experienced mobility issues. For many of them, their child care responsibilities and family obligations have minimized a bit more. And they're living in California and returning to this art form that so many of them learned as young girls and in some cases young men. But I hope you can see here instances where there's some continuity in the techniques of quilting that we've seen in some of the earlier ones. Oh, actually, let me talk about this and I'll go back to that other slide. But when I say continuities, I mean, for example, here is a better image of that strip-pieced quilt out of Oklahoma I showed, and I showed this detail down here earlier, where I hope you can see how blocks and patches of corduroy are being constructed in long columns and then pieced together. And then here is a relatively recent example by Mabel Battle from 1997, where she's assembled it in a very similar technique, but this time using t-shirts and sweatshirts, where so many of the logos remain. And these are all, again, signs of, I'd like to think of them are, yeah, just contemporary signs of the landscape in which she is living in Richmond in the East Bay. So of course, we have the front and the back of a Monterey Jazz Festival t-shirt. There's a Don't Mess with Texas, oh no, sorry, Don't Mess with the US, kind of a reference to the first Iraq War of the early 90s. Of course, Mickey Mouse. Rescue the Planet, I think kind of, again, very much of the early 90s moment when environmental consciousness was becoming much more of a prominent discourse. And my personal favorite detail, these jazzercising pandas on a sweatshirt right in the middle there. But what I hope that kind of comparisons like this with some of the earlier quilts show, that there are continuities, but for so many quilters who are living in the East Bay, they have access to such a different kind of pool of fabric than some of their ancestors did back in the rural South. So if you think of the Bay Area in the 70s and 80s and 90s, where you have thrift stores, you have an abundance of flea markets, where there's this secondary market for fabric that you could just draw upon, to say nothing else of sort of the increasing like mass manufacturing of clothes, where people could just have much more choice about the fabrics they're using. And this is where I can go back to Rosie Lee Tompkins. This is some new work by Tompkins that we did not include in that 2020 exhibition. But it does include denim, but this is not work clothes faded denim that some of her rural ancestors would have used, but this is fashion denim of different kinds of washes and dyes, here interspersed with different kinds of bark cloth in tropical patterns that would have been really common as interior design on like upholstery or curtains, for example. And I love too that she's made these very similar pillows, and these little fluffy parts that you see here are actually pieces of animal fur that she's included to offer this really kind of wild but also like tactile and very sensuous surface to those pieces. Oh gosh, I apologize for the poor quality of this image. I thought it was better. But then you have another artist like Irene Bankhead. Irene Bankhead was born in Prentiss, Mississippi, but lived and spent the later part of her life in Oakland. She was somebody who quilted, who was known to sew and quilt both on her bed and at her kitchen table. She, from what I can learn, she tended to work by herself. So she quilted in solitude at home, but this is just a really wonderful example of one of her bars quilts where, even the color palette is not something I would naturally gravitate towards, but I think she's done this kind of amazing job of giving you these little hits of peach colored fabric at the ends and this one little strip here to offset the muted browns and greens and the cooler blues, to say nothing of these, like, I think really strategic placement of the bright red strips right in the middle. Really, I think the design, a lot of the design that you see in quilts in this collection are really unexpected. Great, so this is a quilt made by Lily Childs. As you can see, the front consists of blocks where you see the continent of Africa pieced together in colors of the Pan-African flag, and contrasted the bright kind of grassy pattern that you see, that is the back of the quilt. So I just kind of wanted to give you the full sense of what it looks like. And I wanted to show this in contrast to, for example, Irene Bankhead, who I mentioned tended to work by herself and quilt by herself in Oakland. Lily Childs is an example of somebody who actually recreated a social network around her quilting. She lived in a senior living apartment and was known to quilt with other residents in her senior living situation. She also quilted with her senior group at Morning Star Baptist Church, located on Market Streets around in like the mid like street 30s. And she created this quilt alongside two of her grandchildren and a neighbor. Yes, and here's a close-up of one of those blocks. We can see that the actual continent itself has been appliqued onto the black square. And then with a sewing machine, I think you can see different borders of nations, of African nations, have been carved out. And then in other cases, names of countries have been embroidered. Now, we don't have a first person account of sort of how these quilt making sessions would have gone. But I often imagine, right, that Lily Childs is using this as a tool and just as a conversation starter with her grandchildren to talk about their identity as a Black family, to think about Black consciousness and cultural pride, thinking about the independence movements, because these are all sort of the names of countries post-independence in many cases. And how that is so much intertwined, might have been intertwined with just understanding how to thread a needle or how to work a sewing machine, right? All of these things are happening at the same time. So I sort of love this quilt for the way I think it kind of prompts us to think about how there's a real invitation to be social as you're making something in a very tangible way. Okay, and finally, we're arriving at the final section of the exhibition, which I think you can see here. So the show kind of runs down this hallway, and then the wall colors shift, and this is where we arrive at. This is the final section of the exhibition, entitled A Living Tradition. And here's where I had extended an invitation to the African American Quilt Guild of Oakland to submit existing work or new work that would be in dialogue with themes of the historical quilts that had come before. And to my delight, what you're seeing is the response. Just a quick note, you'll see like a lot of these quilts are much smaller in scale. That was part of the size criteria. And you'll notice too that the figure and a much more explicit storytelling impulse appears throughout a lot of these quilts. And there are a lot of reasons for that, which I'm happy to talk about later. But I think what delighted me so much, and the larger point of this section, is to show how, and to give a platform for contemporary Black quilters to show their work and to show how many of the same cultural values that inform the earlier parts of the show are still present. So components like honoring members of the past, honoring ancestral histories, thinking about legacy, and also making quilts as functional objects are still very much the same concerns that many of these contemporary artists share. And when I say functional quilts, this large one here on this left-hand wall was made by the artist Carolyn Pope as a 5th anniversary gift for her son-in-law and her daughter. And they very generously took it off their bed so we could show it in the galleries. But just as an example, one pair of quilts that I really enjoyed talking about come from Aura Clay, who made My Migration, appears on the left, and her daughter Niambi Clay, who created Education's Promise, her interpretation of a Jacob Lawrence painting. Now, Aura Clay, in honoring her own migration story, took a segment of a quilt from her own personal collection that her mother had made in Alabama, which is where she was born and where she grew up. It's a little hard to see, but I think you can see that some of the cotton batting that the family would have grown themselves is starting to come out of the areas of wear throughout this antique quilt surface. And so Aura ended up putting a layer of sheer organza over the front just to kind of give that a little bit more security. But she's also then appliqued archival photos of Pullman porters. She really attributes Pullman porters for caring for her while she was on the railroad, making her own migration journey out west at the age of 16. Here she's included a portrait of her mother who made the quilt that is the background for this work. She also includes an image of her cardboard lunch that she would have packed with her, the fried chicken and the pound cake that she carried, for the very real reason that you could never quite know where your next meal would come from when you're making this travel, especially during a time of segregation. You just wouldn't know what spaces you would be allowed into. And so this particular quilt gives such personal detail to her own migration story during this. I think her migration happened, I want to say in the late 50s or 60s. I would have to ask her exactly. As a reflection and extension of Aura's story, Nyambe has created this quilt entitled Education's Promise. The original, as I mentioned, was a Jacob Lawrence painting of the same structure where you see three young girls writing on a chalkboard. In the original painting, the girls are writing out numbers in chalk. But what Nyambe has done is instead embroidered the names of important state and Supreme Court legal cases that have really changed the landscape of public education in California. And the reason she chose this particular topic, not only because Nyambe herself is both trained as a lawyer and works in education advocacy, but for the reason that so many of the public education opportunities that drew her mother from the South out west have been really compromised and curtailed for the current generation. And so Nyambe has used this particular quilt to offer that contemporary commentary on how, again, generationally speaking, opportunities and the landscape is really shifting for them. What I also love about this pairing is because Aura and Nyambe have been very intentionally learning from each other and sharing quilt making between the two of them actively for at least the past 5 or 6 years. And that was intensified more recently when the pair was awarded a grant to really focus and support their quilt making through an apprentice and student structure. Okay, lastly, this section also includes a couple of archival cases. Just to give you a heads up of when you come see the show, you'll have a little glimpse of Eli Leon's own collecting records. So what you see in the middle, this little notebook, is how he kept track of all of the quilts that he bought and sold. Some photographs and correspondence with quilt makers that he was interacting with, and some of the books that he published from different exhibitions that he curated during his own lifetime. And then around them are archival contributions from the 5 African American quilt guilds that are still active within California. So I think you can see there's the San Diego Guild, there's a guild from Los Angeles, Sacramento, and Fresno, and of course Oakland is represented in here. Just again, really kind of just in this small gesture of inclusion to really highlight the different communities and networks that are supporting this art form today. when you come to the gallery, I thought I would just give a shout out to our other staff of designers who created these small mini touch labels, which are little recreations of the actual quilt and artworks on view. Of course, now these quilts are in an art museum. We don't want visitors to touch them, even though, of course, so many of them were made to be handled. So we created these smaller touch labels so people could have a real hands-on experience with at least a little bit of what the quilt feels like. It also gives some insight into how the quilt was constructed, so there can just be a deeper appreciation of how things were put together. And of course, I just did want to share again a little bit about the behind the scenes for the work of this show. Was so much grounded in wanting to connect with and integrate members of the community that the museum customarily hasn't had relationships with. So here, New Connections, I'm just showing you a group of some of the quilters and members of the African American Quilt Guild of Oakland, standing next to a quilt made by their former president, Marion Coleman. The director's reception for this show back in June was really such a moving and celebratory event, with many of the descendant families who are able to come. And as you can see in this example, the family of R.B. Major standing in front of her quilt, it really became it felt like such a family reunion in the space of the gallery, which is not always the case with exhibition openings. This is just to give you another example of what the space felt like. The woman you see here signing posters is Laverne Brackens, again, the 98-year-old quilter who is still alive, who again, we were so thrilled to bring out and to celebrate. She gave a few remarks, and here she is standing with one of her grandsons. Here she is signing posters, and she commented to me at the end of this event, "You know, Elaine, I only ever just wanted to make quilts. I didn't want to be a celebrity." Well, and then I informed her, well, Laverne, it's a bit too late for that. But here she was, I think, really thrilled to see the reception for her work. Another organization that has been a really meaningful partner throughout this whole show has been the African American Quilt Documentation Study Group, led and founded by Adana Richardson, who you see here wearing the black apron. Adana has been a tremendous partner, not only as somebody who is a longtime quilt historian who understands fabric dating and who knows her way around a quilt, but she has also been a grassroots community organizer. Back in Washington State, she organized and recognized the need for a special kind of initiative around African American quilt study. And so she has been, her organization, really the main programs that they hold are public days where families can bring in quilts that they might own made by a family member. They can have it photographed and documented and analyzed by a group of trained volunteers who are quilt historians. But then the families too can bring in any documentation like photographs or obituaries of the quilt maker. And this is a real way to ensure that the story of the quilt and the story of the maker stays connected to the artwork and is made available in a public database. And this is really, I think, has been and is going to be a really incredible resource for anybody interested in studying African American history and quilts. And then, of course, there is an exhibition catalog that we've put together and published. If you're local, please come to the bookstore, or of course, you can look online and order it. And here I'm just going to show you a couple of spreads, again, to give you a sense of the larger universe and conversation that we hope this show will continue to further. So here we have a round table with Adana and a couple of her colleagues who've been really pivotal members within the Black quilt making community and talking about the legacy of Eli Leon. We have a few contributions from contemporary artists. So Adia Millette, she is a studio artist based in Oakland, but for whom African American quilt making traditions is such an inspiration and reference point for her own work. And she talks about the meaning of quilts for her own practice. And of course, there's a rich collection of photographs of how quilts are living in the hands of so many of the artists, along with biographies. So you can learn a little bit more about these women and their backgrounds.
Thank you all so much.